Every story leaves something behind. A whisper, a shadow, a question that was never answered. Here, we dig through the forgotten files, the unsolved mysteries, the chilling true crimes, and the horrors people wish had stayed buried. From haunted legends to real-life nightmares, every tale is pulled straight from the horror archives. So turn down the lights, put on your headphones, and step carefully, because once a story enters the horror archives, it never truly leaves.
Train rides, something most of us have experienced at some point. The steady rhythm of the rails, the flickering lights, the darkened windows that turn into mirrors at night. There's a vulnerability to being on a train that we don't often think about. You can't pull over. You can't get off between stops. You're locked inside a metal tube hurtling through the dark, and you have no control over where it takes you. These are 5 true stories from people who experienced something terrifying on a train, something they still can't explain. And this first story was sent in by a listener named David from Connecticut. He calls it The Woman Who Got Off at Every Stop. It's a quieter one, the kind of story where nothing outwardly violent happens, but the logic of it will stay in your head long after it's over. And the first time I noticed her, we were pulling out of Bridgeport. She was standing on the platform, watching the train leave. The thing is, she'd been sitting 3 rows ahead of me since New Haven. I was taking the Metro North into Grand Central, a ride I've done maybe 300 times. It was a Tuesday evening, late enough that the car was mostly empty. Rain streaked the windows sideways. The fluorescent lights buzzed that specific frequency that makes everything look slightly dead. I had my headphones in but nothing playing, which is probably why I noticed things I normally wouldn't. She was wearing a dark green coat. Not stylish, not shabby. The kind of coat you'd forget immediately. Her hair was pulled back tight, and she was sitting perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead at the seat back in front of her. I only noticed her because of how still she was. Everyone else on the train was on their phone or sleeping. She was just staring. We pulled into Bridgeport and she stood up, walked to the doors and stepped off. I glanced out the window and saw her standing on the platform. Then the train started moving. About 15 minutes later, somewhere around Fairfield, I looked up from my phone and she was back. Same seat, same posture, same green coat, hands folded, staring ahead. I told myself she must have gotten back on. Maybe she'd stepped out for air. People do that, right? Except the stop was maybe 40 seconds long, and I never saw her aboard. And Fairfield is a different station. We pulled into Westport. She stood up again. Same deliberate movement, like a mechanical process. She walked to the doors and stepped off. I watched her through the window. She stood on the platform facing the train and didn't move. The doors closed. We pulled away. I kept my eyes on her seat. It was empty. The train rocked along for another 10 minutes. I started to relax. Then I felt something. Not a sound, not a movement. A weight. The particular awareness you get when someone is watching you. I looked up. She was in the seat directly across the aisle from me now. Same posture, hands folded, but she wasn't staring at the seat back anymore. She was staring at me. Her face was completely neutral, no expression at all. Her eyes were open a little too wide, and they didn't blink the entire time I looked at her. I looked away first. My heart was going, but I told myself there was an explanation. There's always an explanation. We pulled into Norwalk. She stood up. She walked to the doors. She stepped off. This time I watched the platform until it disappeared behind us. She stood there motionless, getting smaller and smaller until the darkness swallowed her. I didn't look away from my phone for the next 20 minutes. I didn't look up when we stopped at Stamford. I didn't look up when we stopped at Greenwich. I kept my eyes locked on the screen, and I listened to the doors open and close, and the car stayed quiet. When the conductor announced we were approaching Grand Central, I finally allowed myself to look up. The car was empty. Every seat was empty. Just me, the buzzing lights, and the rain on the windows. But as I stood up to get my bag from the overhead rack, I noticed something on the seat across the aisle. The one she'd been sitting in. There was a small patch of condensation on the vinyl, roughly the shape of 2 hands pressed together. It was fresh, and it was warm. I got off that train faster than I've ever moved in my life. I took a cab home from Grand Central instead of the subway, because I couldn't bring myself to get on another train. The thing that stays with me. Every station she got off at was further behind us, but every time she came back, she was closer to me. I've thought about that math a lot. If the train had made one more stop, she would have been in my seat. I still take that line to work. I don't have a choice, but I never ride with my headphones in anymore. And if I see a dark green coat anywhere on the platform, I wait for the next train. And it's something about that progression, every stop a little closer. It's the kind of pattern you don't want to think about too hard, because it implies intent and patience. And the next story comes from a listener who asked to go by their initials, RM. They were on an Amtrak sleeper train across the American Southwest when they were moved out of their reserved compartment. The reason they were given didn't make sense. The real reason was worse. This one's called the conductor, who checked my ticket twice. And the conductor told me I was in the wrong seat. I wasn't. I'd reserved it 6 weeks ago, had the confirmation on my phone, and I was looking right at the seat number stamped into the metal above the window. 14C. But he shook his head slowly and said that seat was already occupied. I was on an Amtrak sleeper from Chicago to Los Angeles, the Southwest Chief, 43 hours through the middle of nowhere. I'd booked a roomette because I can't sleep sitting up, and I'd specifically requested the lower level. The car was dim. The vents pushed out stale air that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something older underneath, something like a closet that hadn't been opened in a long time. The tracks hummed beneath us, and the desert was just starting outside the windows, flat and orange and endless. The conductor was an older man, thin, with deep lines in his face. He wasn't rude about it. He was almost apologetic. He said there'd been a booking error and offered to move me to 14A, 2 compartments down. I asked who was in 14C. He paused for a moment too long and then said another passenger. I asked if I could speak to them since it was my reservation. He said that wouldn't be possible and walked away. I took 14A. It was identical to any other roomette. 2 facing seats that converted into a bed, a tiny window, a curtain for privacy. I settled in, but something bothered me. When I'd walked past 14C on the way to my new compartment, the door was open about 2 inches. The light was off inside. I couldn't see anyone. That night I couldn't sleep. The train rocked and clicked, and I lay in the dark staring at the ceiling about 18 inches above my face. Around 1 in the morning, I heard footsteps in the corridor. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They stopped outside my door. I held my breath. Through the gap under the door, I could see the shadow of 2 feet. They stood there for almost a full minute. Then they moved on. The next morning, I went to the dining car for breakfast. The car attendant was different from the conductor, younger, friendlier. I asked casually if the train was full. She said no, actually. It was running at about 60% capacity. I asked about car 14. She checked her tablet and said there were only 2 occupied roomettes in that car. Mine and 14F, not 14C. 14F. The opposite end. I asked her directly if anyone was booked in 14C. She scrolled through something and shook her head. She said 14C had been out of service for 3 months. Maintenance issue. She didn't elaborate. I went back to my car after breakfast. I stopped outside 14C. The door was closed now. I put my ear against it and listened. Nothing at first. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop. Breathing, slow and deep like someone asleep, but underneath it a faint sound, like fingernails moving across fabric. I knocked. The breathing stopped. Everything stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. I found the conductor later that afternoon in the observation car. I told him what the attendant had said about 14C being out of service. I asked him why he told me it was occupied. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "That compartment is occupied." He said it the way you'd say something you wished wasn't true. I asked him what he meant. He said some rooms on long-haul trains develop problems that aren't mechanical. He said it had been reported by multiple passengers over the years. Sounds, a presence, the feeling of being watched in the dark. He said the last person who actually slept in that room requested an emergency stop at 3 in the morning in the middle of the New Mexico desert and refused to get back on the train. That night the footsteps came again. They stopped outside my door again, but this time I heard something new. The handle moved, just slightly, just a fraction of an inch downward. Then it stopped. I didn't sleep for the remaining 19 hours of that trip. When we finally pulled into Los Angeles and I stepped off the train into the sunlight, I looked back at my car. Every window had its shade drawn except one. 14C. And I swear, just for a second, I saw the curtain move. And some places hold onto things. That's the only way I can put it. Long-haul trains run the same routes, through the same darkness for decades. And sometimes, something settles in. And this next story takes things to a different level. It was submitted by a backpacker who was traveling through Eastern Europe alone. What happened to him on an overnight train through Romania? I'll let him explain. He calls it the track that wasn't on the map. And the train took a turn that doesn't exist. I know because I was following our route on GPS the entire time. And at 2:47 a.m., the blue dot slid off the rail line and kept moving into nothing. I was on an overnight train from Budapest to Bucharest. It's a 14-hour ride through Western Romania, and I'd chosen it specifically because I'm the kind of person who prefers trains to planes, even bad trains. And this was a bad train. The compartment smelled like diesel and old cigarettes. The seats were cracked brown vinyl that stuck to your skin. One of the overhead lights flickered in a pattern that felt almost intentional, like a signal. The window was smeared with something I chose not to examine. There were 4 of us in the compartment. Me, an older Romanian couple who spoke no English and fell asleep within minutes, and a young guy across from me who said he was a student from Cologne. His name was Eric. He was the one who first noticed something was wrong. We'd been moving through the Carpathians for about 2 hours. The mountains outside were black shapes against a slightly less black sky. No moon. Eric leaned over and showed me his phone. The GPS showed us on the main line between Brasov and Siasora. Then the train slowed and we felt it switch tracks. A physical lurch to the left. On his screen, the dot drifted away from the highlighted route. I pulled up my own GPS. Same thing. We were heading northeast now, away from the main line, into a section of the map that showed no tracks, no roads, no towns. Just green. Forest. Eric went to find a conductor. He came back 10 minutes later looking pale. He said the corridor was empty. Every compartment he'd checked was either empty or had passengers who were asleep. Not just asleep. He said it was like they were unconscious. He tried to wake 2 of them and they wouldn't respond. I looked at the Romanian couple across from us. Their heads were tilted at identical angles. Their mouths were slightly open. Their chests rose and fell in perfect sync, which is not something 2 separate people do. The train was slowing down. Through the window, trees pressed close on both sides. Their branches scraped the glass like fingers. The flickering overhead light went out. The only illumination came from our phone screens. Then the train stopped. Not at a station. There was no platform, no lights, no sign. Just forest, thick and absolute on both sides. The engine went quiet. The ventilation stopped. The silence was so complete I could hear Eric breathing. We sat there for maybe 5 minutes. Then Eric pointed out the window and whispered. I looked. There were people standing in the trees. Not close, maybe 30 meters out. But there were a lot of them. They were standing perfectly still among the trunks, and they were all facing the train. I couldn't make out features. They were just shapes, dark, human-shaped forms that were slightly too tall and slightly too thin. They didn't move. They didn't need to. The fact of them was enough. I counted 7 on my side. Eric said he could see more on his. One of them took a step forward, then another. They moved with a strange fluidity, like their joints didn't work the way ours do, like something was approximating how a person walks without having practiced enough. Then the train lurched. The engine roared back to life. The lights snapped on. We started moving slowly at first, then faster. The figures in the trees didn't chase us. They just watched. As we picked up speed, they disappeared back into the dark. Within 20 minutes, my GPS showed us back on the main line. The Romanian couple woke up at the next station as if nothing had happened. The conductor came through and checked tickets like it was a normal night. I tried to ask him about the detour. He looked at me blankly and said the train had been on schedule the entire time. No stops, no detours. When I showed him my GPS history, the deviation was gone. A clean line from Brasov to Siasora. Eric showed his too. Same thing. Wiped. Eric and I exchanged numbers, but he never responded to my messages after that trip. I tried his email a few months later and it bounced. I've searched online for anything about that stretch of forest. Unexplained stops, figures in the trees, anything. I found one post on a Romanian travel forum from 2014 that described almost exactly what we experienced. Same route, same time of night. The post had no replies and the account was deleted. Sometimes I think about those figures and what would have happened if the train hadn't started again. If we just sat there in the dark while they got closer. I think that's what the deleted post was about, the version where the train didn't start. And I did try to find that forum post he mentioned. It doesn't exist anymore, but the route does. The Budapest to Bucharest overnight still runs through that same stretch of the Carpathians, and it still passes through there around 3 in the morning. And this fourth story is from a traveler in Japan. It involves a tunnel, a short tunnel that should have taken 30 seconds to pass through. It took 45 minutes, and what happened inside it. This is the kind of story that makes you afraid of your own reflection. He calls it the tunnel that took too long. And we entered the tunnel at 6:14 p.m. I know because I checked my watch when the daylight disappeared. According to the schedule, the tunnel was 900 meters long. At our speed, that should have taken about 30 seconds. We were still inside it 45 minutes later. This was on a regional train in northern Japan, the kind that runs through the mountains between small towns that tourists never visit. I was the only foreigner in the car. There were maybe 15 other passengers, mostly older, mostly quiet. The car smelled like green tea and rain. The seats were immaculate. Everything about the ride had been exactly what I expected, which is to say, perfectly efficient and perfectly boring. Until the tunnel. The first 30 seconds were normal. The windows went black. The overhead lights cast that warm yellow glow. Reflections of the interior appeared in the glass. Then 30 seconds became a minute. A minute became 2. I figured it was a longer tunnel than the schedule indicated. Japan has thousands of tunnels. Some of them are quite long. I went back to reading. At the 5-minute mark, I noticed the first wrong thing. My reflection in the window wasn't matching my movements. Not dramatically, not in a way I could have been sure about. But when I turned a page, the reflection seemed to turn a half-second late. When I looked up, it was already looking at me. I told myself it was a trick of the light. The brain is bad at processing reflections. At the 10-minute mark, the lights flickered. Just once, just briefly. But in that half-second of darkness, I saw something outside the window. We were in a tunnel. There shouldn't have been anything outside the window, except rock wall rushing past. But there was space out there. Depth. And in that depth, there was something pale. The lights came back and I couldn't see it anymore. Just my reflection, which was now smiling. I wasn't smiling. I was staring at the window with my mouth slightly open, but the reflection had the corners of its lips turned up. Not dramatically, just enough to be wrong. I looked around the car. The other passengers were all still in their seats. None of them seemed concerned. An old woman across the aisle was knitting. A businessman was reading a newspaper. Nobody was looking out the windows. I checked my watch. 20 minutes. We'd been in this tunnel for 20 minutes. I stood up and walked toward the front of the car. I wanted to find a conductor, anyone in a uniform. As I walked up the aisle, I passed the other passengers, and that's when I noticed the second wrong thing. They were all doing the same thing they'd been doing when we entered the tunnel. Exactly the same thing. The knitting woman's needles were in the same position. The businessman was on the same page. A young woman who'd been sleeping had her head at the same angle. They looked like a photograph. I reached the door at the front of the car and looked through the glass into the next car. It was empty, completely empty, but the lights were on, and I could see that every seat had an indentation in it, as if someone had just been sitting there. I didn't open the door. Something told me not to. I went back to my seat. 25 minutes now. The reflection in my window was still smiling, and it had moved. It was no longer in the position I'd been sitting. It was standing, pressed close to the glass from the other side. Its hands were flat against the window. I could see details I shouldn't have been able to see in a reflection. The pores of its skin, the texture of its coat, which was the same coat I was wearing but darker, like a version that had been left in the dark too long. Its eyes were mine, but the pupils were wrong. Too large, like they'd dilated to take in light that didn't exist. I closed my eyes. I kept them closed. The train burst out of the tunnel at 6:58 p.m. 44 minutes. Daylight flooded the car and I opened my eyes. The reflection was normal. The passengers were moving. The knitting woman had progressed several rows. The businessman was on a different page. The sleeping woman was awake and on her phone. We arrived at the next station 2 minutes later, right on schedule. I got off and didn't get back on. I looked up that tunnel later. It's 847 meters long. At standard speed, it takes approximately 28 seconds to pass through. Here's what I can't stop thinking about. When I closed my eyes in the tunnel, just before the light came back, I felt breath on my face. Not from the reflection, not from outside the window, from directly in front of me, inside the car. And whatever it was, it exhaled slowly, like it had been waiting a very long time to get that close. And I want you to think about something before this last story. Every time you ride a train at night and you see your reflection in the dark glass, you trust that it's you. You trust that it's doing what you're doing, but you've never really checked. Have you? And this final story is the one that disturbed me the most when I first read it. It was sent in by a woman from Philadelphia who doesn't want her name used at all. She was on a routine commuter train when she realized that the other passengers in her car weren't. Passengers? Not anymore. She calls it the passengers who were already dead. And I recognized one of them from the news. That's what started it. A man sitting 4 rows ahead of me in the quiet car, reading a paperback, wearing a blue windbreaker. I'd seen his face on a missing persons flyer at the station not 30 minutes earlier. This was a commuter train from Philadelphia to Trenton. A nothing ride. 45 minutes through suburbs and industrial parks. It was a Friday evening, overcast, the kind of grey that makes everything look like a photocopy. The car was about half full. The seats had that worn fabric that holds decades of human warmth. The air was thick with recycled heat. Someone's coffee had spilled somewhere and the whole car smelled faintly of it, mixed with wet clothing and metal. The missing persons flyer had been taped to a column near the ticket machines. White male 53, last seen January 9th. It was now March. The photo showed a man with a round face and thin hair, smiling at a barbecue. The man on the train had the same face, but he wasn't smiling. He was reading with an expression of absolute blankness, the way you look when you're not actually processing the words. I stared longer than I should have. I pulled out my phone and searched his name. The results made my mouth go dry. He hadn't just gone missing. He'd been found. 3 weeks after his disappearance, his body was recovered from the Delaware River. Cause of death was drowning. The funeral had been in February. I was looking at a dead man. I put my phone down and took a breath. I told myself I was wrong. People look alike. Flyers are low resolution. I was tired and making connections that didn't exist. Then I started looking at the other passengers. It was a slow thing, like adjusting to darkness. The more I looked, the more wrong things I found. The woman 2 rows ahead, and to the right was wearing a hospital bracelet. Not unusual on its own, but the bracelet was on the outside of her sleeve, like she didn't know it was there, or like she'd left somewhere in a hurry. The ink on it was faded to the point of illegibility, which doesn't happen in a day or two. That takes weeks. The teenager by the window was wearing a backpack with a school logo I recognized. I'd gone to that school. It closed in 2003. A man near the front was reading a newspaper. I could just make out the date on the top of the page. November 12th, 2019. It was 2024. Each detail alone was explainable. Together, they formed a pattern I didn't want to see. I noticed their skin next. Not all of them, but several. There was a quality to it that I can only describe as settled, like wax that had cooled. The color was present but static. No flush in the cheeks, no pink in the knuckles. The man with the blue windbreaker turned a page, and I watched his hand. His fingers moved, but the tendons didn't shift under the skin the way they should. It was like watching a puppet operated from inside. The overhead lights buzzed. The train rocked. Nobody spoke. Nobody coughed. Nobody shifted in their seats. The car was perfectly, absolutely silent except for the sound of the rails. I stood up to move to another car. As I walked toward the rear door, I passed each row and I looked at their faces. I couldn't help it. Every single one of them had their eyes fixed on something. A book, a window, their hands. But none of them were actually seeing. The focus wasn't there. Their eyes had the flat quality of glass, of things that catch light but don't process it. I reached the door and pulled the handle. It didn't open. I pulled harder. It was locked. I turned to try the front door, and that's when I realized they were all looking at me. Every passenger in the car had turned their head and was staring directly at me. The man in the blue windbreaker, the woman with the hospital bracelet, the teenager with the dead school's backpack. All of them. perfectly still, perfectly silent. Their expressions hadn't changed. They were blank, empty, but their eyes were locked onto me with an intensity that felt physical, like hands pressing against my chest. The man in the blue windbreaker opened his mouth, not to speak, just opened it, wide, wider than a mouth should open. I could see that it was dark inside, not the normal dark of a mouth, a deeper dark, a dark that went back too far. The others began to open their mouths too, one by one down the rows like a wave. The silence somehow deepened. I could hear something coming from those open mouths. Not a sound exactly, an absence of sound, a vacuum, like they were inhaling something I couldn't see. The rear door clicked. I shoved it open and stumbled into the next car, which was bright and noisy and full of normal people on their phones, and a kid crying, and a man arguing about football. I sat down and didn't move until Trenton. When I got off, I looked back at the quiet car through the platform window. It was empty, every seat, but the overhead lights were flickering in a pattern, one by one down the car, like something was walking through it. I went home and searched for recent deaths along the Philadelphia to Trenton corridor. In the past 5 years, 14 people have died on or near that commuter line. Heart attacks on platforms, a fall between cars, 2 suicides, a man found in a rail yard with no explanation. I counted the passengers in that quiet car in my memory. I've gone over it again and again. 14. There were exactly 14. I don't take that train anymore. I drive, but sometimes, when I'm on the highway and a commuter train runs parallel to me on the tracks below, I can see into the lit windows. And sometimes there's a car where the passengers aren't moving, where every head is turned toward the highway, toward me. I tell myself it's just the angle, the speed, a trick of the light, but I keep driving a little faster every time. And 14 deaths, 14 passengers, and they noticed her noticing them, which means they know who she is. And maybe now, they are just waiting for the right ride. That's going to do it for this one. If you have a true scary story you'd like to share with me, send it to my email or my Reddit. As always, stay safe out there.
And that's where tonight's file closes, but the archives are far from empty. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and join us as we uncover more horrors, mysteries, and true crimes hidden in the horror archives. Until next time, keep the lights low, keep listening, because you never know what story we'll uncover next.